And yeah, I think we are now live on Facebook and YouTube. On YouTube, it will be posted simultaneously. So, yeah. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to today's Carvan special lecture. I am Ishan Sharma, founder of Carvan. And with me today, I have a very special guest. Somebody who has been an inspiration to a whole generation of history students in Delhi University and in India, Dr. Pankaj Jha. Dr. Pankaj Jha teaches history at Lady Shri Ram College for women in New Delhi. The primary interest of his research interest is literary cultures of the Middle Ages. The languages he has worked on include Persian, Sanskrit, Maithili, and Apabhramsa. His research articles in Hindi as well as are in English are available widely in peer-reviewed journals and have been widely acclaimed in scholarly articles. He has also been on the editorial board of the international journal called Indian Economic and Social History Review. And today, Dr. Jha is going to speak about the Vidyapatis in history and historiography, a missing link. So, without further ado, I formally welcome and invite Dr. Jha to present today's Carvan special lecture. Thank you so much, sir, for accepting our invitation and for agreeing to do this lecture. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Ashan. That was a little too generous an introduction. That sounded like someone else. But I'm glad that you mentioned that I'm primarily a teacher. I love to be with students, and hence I am primarily a student who's learning with other students and continuously exploring new and exciting avenues of medieval Indian history. Uh, so, as most of you would be aware, the title of my talk today might sound a bit intriguing to many of you because it says the Vidyapatis in plural. And this title actually throws back to a particular experience I had when I visited Vidyapati's ancestral village in North Bihar, where I was looking for places associated with this historical figure, and someone in a restaurant pointed me out towards an old man who was apparently a wise man of the village. And this is the village Bisfi near Madhubani in North Bihar. So this wise man, when I approached him, he asked me, "So who are you looking for?" So I said, "I'm looking for places associated with Vidyapati." And he said, "Which Vidyapati?" So I said, "You don't know Vidyapati?" He said, "Of course I know Vidyapati, but which Vidyapati are you looking for?" So in Maithili, he talked with me, and he mentioned many Vidyapatis actually. And so he mentioned that there is a Vidyapati who people sing songs of. There was another Vidyapati who was a great scholar of Sanskrit and wrote books on statecraft and various other things, aesthetics and so on. And then he said there was another Vidyapati who was a great devotee of Shiva. And there was another Vidyapati who was a courtier in the courts of some of the greatest rulers of North Bihar, and so on. And he said, then he laughed and he said, there is another Vidyapati who is often resurrected by the local politicians of Bihar. And there is a memorial that is devoted to him. So, it was very intriguing. So I said, do you really mean to say that there are many Vidyapatis? And he laughed. And am I audible, Ashan?
Yes, sir, you are.
Ishan, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so he said, well, you don't understand. Vidyapati was not an ordinary human being like you and me. He was a Yoga Purush. That's in Maithili, he said he was a Yug Purush. What is a Yug Purush? A Yug Purush is someone who is supposed to turn the course of history. Who's supposed to turn the times in which he lives and give it a new direction. So for this man and for many others, a man who could change the course of history, a man who actually lived in many guises, a man who is remembered in many different ways, a man who is colorful enough, who is multifarious enough in very different ways. Now, why is it that we should bother about someone called Vidyapati in the 21st century? That's the primary question that hopefully I will be able to throw some light on. Because, of course, historically, there have been thousands of such poets, thousands of scholars, thousands of such so-called historical people. And I'm not, going to sort of talk about one of those conspiracy theories which have become very fashionable these days when you pick up a character from your old school NCRT books and then make a YouTube out of it saying that there is a conspiracy that nobody told you about this character, even if the character is known to you from your school textbooks. Now, it is true that Vidyapati has been relatively ignored by historians, but I don't think there is any conspiracy to hide this great achiever of 15th century from cultural achiever of 15th century from such controversy. There's no such conspiracy. What I'm going to talk about is the fact that one, Vidyapati has consistently been selected and reselected historically, even in his own, immediately after his own lifetime, just a few decades later, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was born, 1480s. And in the 17th century, when the biographies of Chaitanya is written, it is very prominently mentioned that Chaitanya had this habit of listening to songs composed by Vidyapati alongside those of Chandidas. And every time he would listen to Vidyapati's songs, he would go in a trance. A few years later, Abul Fazl wrote in Akbarnama that Vidyapati is one of the most popular poets of this area who wrote these songs that he called Lahchari, which is clearly a spin-off from the Nachari songs, the songs devoted to the celebration of the love of Shiv and Parvati, and generally devoted to Lord Shiva. And of course, yes, Vidyapati was famous for those songs, but he was famous for many other things which Abul Fazl did not mention. In the next century, in the 17th century, when Lochan Kavi writes his great anthology of songs in particular meters, his masterpiece on music, he gives Vidyapati the most prominent place. In 19th century, it is interesting that one of the Sanskrit works of Vidyapati was translated into English, partially translated, only parts of it, in an abridged version. And it was circulated among the young lads of England in order to inculcate culturally, acceptable habits, in order to inculcate good conduct, and in order to impart lessons in ethics and morality to them. Very soon, this text was also included as part of the civil services examination. So guidebooks emerged around this text. This was a text called Purush Pariksha, and I'll come to it in a moment. In 20th century, one of the most interesting moments in this afterlife of Vidyapati was when a young Rabindranath Tagore actually adopted the name of Bhanu Kavi and started writing in imitation of Vidyapati. He was so infatuated with Vidyapati's songs that he tried to imitate Vidyapati's language and meters and tried to write songs, compose songs in the way that he imagined Vidyapati would have done. 1937, you have the famous Devaki Bose making a film on a biopic on Vidyapati, in which, not surprisingly, he cast great stars of the time, Kandan Devi, Chaya Devi, Prithvi Raj Kapoor, and so on. So you have this figure of Vidyapati actually uh, marking the cultural scene of North India right from 15th century onwards. Okay, and that's where I think we need to understand why it is that historians have been running away from Vidyapati. Uh, as I said, this is not a conspiracy. The reason why historians have paid a lot of attention to many other poets of the time or around this time. So you have, for example, Amir Khusro, you have men like uh, Surdas, Banarsi Das, Keshav Das, you have people like Kabir and Tadu and Nanak, and everyone has been attended to by historians, writing biographies, writing about the significance of these their texts and so on. Or if nothing else, they would fit them into the larger history of Indian literature. So someone like Ramchandra Shukla, for example, would give a lot of space to Tulsi Das, to Kabir Das, to Sur Das, but not to Kabir, not to Vidyapati. Vidyapati figures in his last chapter on what he called the Putkal Rachana. Putkal Rachana. Putkal means, literally would mean stray compositions. Now, Ramchandra Shukla, as many of you would know, wrote what is now the most authoritative history of Hindi literature when he wrote his Hindi Sahitya Ka Itihas. Why did he put Vidyapati in Putkal Rachana? Because Ramchandra Shukla made a periodization of Vidyapati, of Hindi literature, and he divided it up into Adi Kal, which is also called Veer Ras Kal, followed by Bhakti Kal, followed by Riti Kal, followed by Adhanik Kal, and Vidyapati wouldn't fit into any of this. Technically, if we go strictly by the periods, Vidyapati should have come in the Bhakti Kal, but he doesn't fit only there. He fits also in Adikal, he fits also in Ritikal, and so on. So he defies those generic boundaries, he defies those period, this scheme of periodization. And why is that important? I'll come to that a little later. For the time being, let me tell you a story. Let me tell you a story to begin with, in order to sort of give you a sense of the world of Vidyapati. So this is the seed story of his text, his text Purush Pariksha. Literally, Purush Pariksha would mean test of man. Uh, so here is the story. The story goes something like this. This is the seed story. Purush Pariksha is a collection of stories. So the story goes like this. Once upon a time, there was a king, a very famous, very successful, very dharmic, righteous king, who had a daughter, a young nubile daughter, and he called his minister, a learned minister, and asked him that he requested that his daughter was marriageable and he should help him look for a suitable bridegroom. The minister replied that the king should look out for a man and marry her to him. So the Raja was perplexed. He said that, of course, I will marry her to a man, but that's not an answer. Where do I look for a suitable man? But the minister insisted that all he needed to do was to look for a man. He explained. He said that actually there are many creatures going around this earth who look like men, who are shaped like men, but they are not real men. It's very difficult to come across a real man. And hence, he advised the Raja to go out and look for a real man. So the Raja asked him, but how do I identify a real man? How does one know who is a real man? So the minister explained that actually a real man has certain characteristics. You have to find those characteristics. What are those characteristics? The Raja asked. The minister smiled. He said, look, a Raja, a real man must have three qualities. Veer Sudhi Savidyascha. That's what he said in Sanskrit. He should be Veer. That is, he should be heroic. He should be valorous. Sudhi. That is someone who is discerning, meaning intelligent, should be talented. And Savidyascha. He should be learned. He should be learned means what? He should be trained in certain sciences, shastras. Okay, so Veer, Sudhi, Savidyascha. These are the three qualities. So the Raja said, but how does one identify these characteristics? I mean, how do I go to a man and look for Virta in him? How do I know if he's Veer? So the minister said, it's not that simple. Actually, for each of these categories, there are other subcategories. So a Veer can be one of the many kinds of Veer. So the Raja asked for explanation. And the minister went further and said, look, I'll give you some examples. So, for example, Arjun is Yuddhavi, Yudhishthir is Satyavi, uh, Harishchandra is Satyavi, Karna is Danvi. The Raja said, but it's very difficult because these people that you mentioned, Arjun and Karna, characters from Mahabharata and Ram, they belong to a different time. The truth in those times were different. Those are bygone eras. These truths are no longer applicable in our time. Why don't you give me some examples from this time so that I can make out what kind of characteristics I should be looking for? And Subudhi, the minister, said, by all means. And he said, let me tell you stories. Let me tell you stories to explain each of these qualities and also to illustrate what these qualities are not. So there follows in Purush Pariksha 44 stories, most of which, in fact, are maybe called the example stories, Udaharana Katha, and the others which are Pratyudaharana Katha, counter example stories. So if there is a story about how to be, say, how to be a Danveer, that is heroic in terms of your ability to give arms or be generous, then there is also a story of how not to be a Danveer. That is a story about a miser. Okay, so in other words, if you think of this text, Purush Pariksha, composed in Sanskrit, and pay attention to its details, pay attention to its historicity, pay attention to where it is coming from and where it is going, you realize many different things. One, it is a text composed in 15th century, that is in the middle of the medieval period, in Sanskrit. So out there in 15th century, there is still a world of Sanskrit literature, a vibrant world of Sanskrit literature. And this immediately reminds us of the fact that more Sanskrit literature was composed in medieval period than in the ancient period, something that you would have no sense of if you only studied the mainstream history of medieval India, because mainstream medieval history is actually entirely, almost exclusively based on Persian literature, except when you're talking about Bhakti movement. So here is a text which is a collection of stories. It is also a text which is perhaps the first of its kind text, the first of its kind text to have ever been written in the history of human civilization on masculinity. So this is a text which also claims to tell you what real men look like. So what is real masculinity? Okay, that's what the text does. Thirdly, the author of the text actually claims that it is a text on Naya or Niti. Literally, Niti in Sanskrit refers to Dandaniti. That is, it is actually an acronym for Dandaniti, that is state policy or political ethics, more specifically. So it is a text on political ethics. Now remember, the first known text on political ethics was perhaps Panchatantra, again told in the format of a story. And that was told almost 2000 years before, a little less than 2000 years before Vidyapati wrote Purush Pariksha in roughly the second decade of 15th century. So, why is this important? It is important because, apart from all that I have already shared, because of the fact that the corpus of Vidyapati's literature is very, very diverse in every possible sense. So here is a man living in a small principality of North Bihar, which is not even on one of the main trade routes of the Indian subcontinent. And what is he doing? He just can't stop writing. He has written everything that you would expect a Sanskrit scholar to write. And he has written more. So he wrote a text on law, Vibharsa. He wrote a text on geography that is called it's a shorter version of Purush Pariksha, and it's called Bhu Parikrama. He wrote a classical play, a classical play following all the standard tropes and conventions of all the plays, Manimanjari Natika. He wrote two texts on Sringar, the aesthetic representation of love, some sort of, you can say, aestheticized erotica, that is Kirti Pataka and Harike. These are short text storybooks that celebrate in somewhat allegorical form, the love relationship between two worldly characters who stand in for parallel to divine characters. He also wrote a text, as we saw, on masculinity. He wrote another text on Shaiva rituals. He wrote a book of prayers for Durga, Durga Bhakti Tarankuli. He wrote a book of prayers for Ganga, Ganga Dan Vakyavali, Ganga Vakyavali. Then he also wrote a ritual text for Shaivs. Okay? So Shaiv Sarvaswasar is one of his more better known texts. But what does he become famous for? He becomes famous for a large number of songs that he composed. And these songs give voice to different groups of people, usually perhaps amongst the upper caste. But it gives voice to the courtiers, it gives voice to the panditas, it gives voice to women of different groups, especially peasant women and women of the upper caste families, and so on. But perhaps two of his texts, apart from Purush Pariksha, that are most remarkable. One is a text on writing. Excuse me. One of these is a text on writing, Likhnavali. It is a text which provides a set of imagined, fictive, model letters and documents. Okay, it's the most extraordinary text of its kind because it imagines a world. It imagines a world full of kings and ministers and fighters and soldiers and military commanders and chefs and cooks and servants and slaves and grihastha, people who occupy sort of who are householders, and it then gives you letters exchanged between them. These are all fictive, but they are supposed to function as model letters for those who wish to learn the craft of letter writing and documentation. So here is a text for which, again, like Purush Pariksha, there is absolutely no precedence. For Purush Pariksha, in fact, you might say there are some, except that they don't talk about masculinity like Purush Pariksha does, but at least there are Katha texts written earlier. But for Likhnavali, there is absolutely no precedence. And he's writing right in the middle of 15th century about early 15th century, sorry, he's writing about writing. Why is this important? This is important because documentation is important. because documentation is crucial to state formation. It is crucial to states becoming far more elaborate, complex, powerful, centralized, and obsessed with record keeping. In fact, if you look at the history of states all over the world, the insatiable appetite of the states to generate documents, to frame people within papers, to put things to writing, and to attribute, to imbue writing with authority, still echoes in some of our muhavras, sayings, popular sayings. Say, for example, when we say, this is what you're supposed to do, and in Hindi, in North India, you say, kahan likha, where is it written? As if the same thing was written somewhere and shown to you, you would immediately accept it. But writing, authority, even in English, is cognate with author. Okay? So the fact that in 15th century, someone feels the need to write a book for teaching how to write letters and how to frame official documents, affidavits, for example, is extraordinary because it tells you of the fact that this is a time when all the paraphernalia for state building is somehow congealing up. And it is important because we're talking about 15th century, which is the missing link in the title of my talk, where I refer to the many Vidyapatis and the missing link. What is the missing link? If you remember, much of the standard historiography of medieval India actually starts in the 12th, 13th century, comes up to 14th, skips the 15th, jumps to 16th, and starts the narrative with Akbar or sometimes Sher Shah. I'm talking primarily about the political narrative. Now, this political narrative is focused too much on dynasties and dynastic fortunes. If it was to focus on a much broader, more complex, more nuanced sense of political history, it would also bother to look at the state of knowledge formation, the state of political ethics, the state of narratives about what is political ethics, what is politics, how is a state built. Does it follow directly from great wars like First War of Panipat? Or do you need other things, other paraphernalia for state building? And where do these paraphernalia come from? When Akbar establishes his great state in the beginning in the 1560s, usually we are told that for background, we should look at his ancestry. So look at the history of Timur and Samarkand and Afghanistan and travels of Babur and maybe Changezid Yasha to see where he's coming from. But Akbar hardly had much to do with all of this. And even if he had, as sometimes Abul Fajl would suggest, then what about the people over whom he was going to rule? Did people have a history? And did that prior history before Akbar was born and destined to occupy the throne in Agra and Delhi? Did people have a history? And did that history have a bearing on the state building process? What was that history? What did people know? What did they think about state? What did they think about politics? What did they think the state should be doing? Did Akbar fit into it? Is it a question worth asking for historians? I would suggest yes, it is a question worth asking. And I would also suggest that if we pay attention to the little streams that were feeding into the wider realm of political ethics and state building processes, to use a more fashionable term, the state of knowledge formations. If we pay attention to these small little streams like those of Vidyapati that are feeding into this knowledge formation, you would be in a better position to understand what was happening with people of North India around this time. And the only way in which we can understand it is by looking at the multilingual literary corpus of the 14th and the 15th and the early 16th century. So what I'm trying to suggest here is not by any means the only, not by any means that the reason why we need to understand the or look at or analyze and interpret the uh, literature of 14th and 15th and early 16th century is to understand the Mughal state better. No, I'm suggesting that the entire structure of political history, dynastic as it has become, or at best institution history of institution building, should relax itself, free itself from the clutches of this very narrowly defined political narrative, and expand itself into the realm of what is otherwise more constrictedly defined as cultural history. Because if there is a relationship between state and society, it has to be, among other things, with reference to the so-called cultural history, even beyond patronage. Why do I say this? Even beyond patronage? Because patronage networks are the only means through which state and society, or power and literature, or king and poet are related conventionally in Indian historiography. So let's look at who the patrons of Vidyapati was. Vidyapati's patrons were very, very ordinary. They were humble chieftains. They were humble chieftains of North Bihar. They were not even part of mainstream political narrative in medieval times. It is only with the coming of the Mughal state that Tirhut becomes a sarkar, okay, which is like a bunch of parganas brought together. Otherwise, it was tucked underneath the Himalayan valley, part of the Nepal domain. Okay, so in fact, part of the cultural domain of Vidyapati, in the region in which he would move around, was actually a part of it is now in Nepal. So the interesting thing is, that as far as this history of 15th century is concerned, it is available to us from Vidyapati, who was patronized by a local ruler. But what did he write? He wrote about his political vision was expansive. It was full of the aspirations of imperial. He talked about the Chakravartin Raja. He talked about a state which is all expansive. So in Kirti Lata, for example, when he is, and that's the last text I want to talk about with reference to Vidyapati, in Kirti Lata, which is written in Avhat language, he tells you the story of the travels of Kirti Singh, okay, who who makes a visit to Jaunpur, the Sharki Sultan, in order to enlist the Sultan's support, his lost kingdom, his ancestral domain. He lost his ancestral domain to a local Turkish warrior called Arslan. And he made this visit to Jaunpur to supplicate to the Jaunpur king at that time, Ibrahim Shah Sharki, and ask for support so that he could gain his kingdom back. He eventually did it. Now, what is most interesting is the fact that when he visits Jaunpur, he writes about Jaunpur extensively, and he celebrates Jaunpur as as a wonderful, almost magical uh, city created by this great majestic ruler Ibrahim Shah. And he describes Ibrahim Shah as the most righteous ruler of all times. So the imagery, the idiom he uses in order to celebrate the rulership of Ibrahim Shah is very interesting, because it is full of the references to Indic Sanskritic mythologies, saying that Airavata is sleeping, and Vishnu is taking rest because of the fact that Ibrahim Shah is such a righteous ruler that Vishnu no longer has any business in his hand. This was, again, a standard literary trope. Okay, he is not the first person, and he was not the last person to have used this expression to extol the virtues of a king. Okay, but the point that we have to keep in mind is the fact that here is a man who talks wide-eyed about, again, a regional ruler. Ibrahim Shah was also a regional ruler, but Vidyapati talks about him as if he is the ruler of the world. Why? Not because Vidyapati did not know, would not have known the real political boundaries of the Sharki state. I think it is because of the fact that Vidyapati knew that he was not writing history. His contemporaries knew that he was not writing history. He was following the literary conventions of what the Sanskrit aesthetic literature writers would call akhyayika. That is, some kind of a biographical, heroic account of a particular individual. In that context, he would celebrate the city, he would describe in great majesty the court, he would talk about the hundreds and thousands of valorous men who went there in search of, with their supplications to the majestic ruler of the time. But for him, this majestic city was a literary medium through which he perhaps expressed his own political aspirations and the political aspirations of the other upper caste, male, upper class political elites of the time. So even though his immediate circumstances might have been restricted to a small principality, he was also connected to the far more expensive and far more closely networked world of Sanskrit intellectuals, uh, 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 to, 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 to stay, as far as his creativity is concerned, to stay within the bounds of his region. So his creativity actually did not know such bounds, and it gave expression to most exalted of, most expensive of political aspirations. In other words, what I'm trying to suggest here is that paying attention to Vidyapati helps us question the periodization of the history of Hindi literature, because he could write songs of devotion with equal ease as he could write the texts of what later came to be known as the Riti Kavya or the Sringar Kavya. So he is also important because he helps us question even the division within the Bhakti movement. So one of the questions that modern historians have fought about is whether he is a Shaiv or a Vaishnav or simply a professional writer. So Ramchandra Shukla would say that he is a Shaiv. There's no doubt about it. There are these stories, I think, in the poster that Karwa put up. It's a depiction of the famous story that one of his, servants turned out to be a devoted servant of his Ugna turned out to be actually none other than Lord Shiva himself. So obviously he was a Shaiv. But you look at his song corpus, the maximum number of songs are actually devoted to the love of Radha and Krishna. Okay, that's why Chaitanya loved him. That's why Chaitanya went into a trance listening to his songs. But if you go to his village and ask them, so who did Vidyapati worship? They will say they worshipped Bhagavati. He worshipped Bhagavati. Who is Bhagavati? Bhagavati is this, primal goddess. Okay, you can say an incarnation if you go by the Puranic Vedic context, the incarnation of Kali or Durga, a local incarnation maybe. So, in other words, what we are trying to understand here is the fact that the same person, depending on the genre, depending on what he was trying to accomplish, could actually express the aspirations of very many different class, so much so that his individual self is completely buried in there. But we also need to understand that modern classification, in fact, in the insatiable appetite of modern age for classification itself needs to be questioned when we study the medieval period, and we must pay attention to 15th century in order to understand a lot that at the present state of our knowledge, we don't. Okay, so basically, I have, as I realize, I have gone about covering the theme of many Vidyapatis in somewhat random fashion, but that was deliberate, and I hope it was provocative enough for people to, have curiosities, ask questions, challenge me, raise parallel narratives, whatever. I would welcome all sorts of comments. Thank you, Asha.
Thank you very much, sir, for delivering this such an enriching lecture on a famous personality, yet lesser known personality of Indian history, of the region that was called Mithilanchal, Vidyapati, and who is also known as the father of Bengali literature. So we have a question for you from Professor Dev Sohal, and his question is: do we find references to people's resistance to the Mughal Emperor Akbar in the Sanskrit literature of Vidyapati, especially the revolt of Dullah Bhatti in the Bar area of present West Punjab, now in Pakistan?
Vidyapati lived in 15th century. He was probably born in late 14th century, and second half of the 14th century, and died sometime in the 1530s or 1430s or 40s. So there's no question of Vidyapati having anything to do with Akbar, who came to power in 1556 and died in 1605. Akbar actually was born about more than 100 years after Vidyapati died. So no such reference is there. But I can tell you that in Purush Pariksha, where there are so many different stories about exemplary characters who embody specific virtues of being a man, over there in that Sanskrit text, there are a few stories with reference to certain so-called Muslim rulers. So, for example, there is a reference to uh, you know Muhammad Tughlaq as Muhammad Shah. There is another reference to Shihabuddin, probably the Muhammad Shihabuddin Muizuddin Ghori of late 12th, early 13th century. But no reference to Akbar is possible in Vidyapati.
Another question from Professor Sohel is: how many times do we find the term Hindu in the writings of Vidyapati? Do we find that term?
Uh, Very interesting question. You see, I'm saying interesting because the term Hindu actually is mentioned, several times in one particular context in a text called Kirti Lata, which is an Apabhramsa text. And the reference is very interesting. In fact, it has been quoted widely by many historians, most recently by David Lawrence in his Who Invented Hinduism. The context of this reference is very significant because it only confirms some of the ideas which were expressed earlier by historians like Richard Eaton, which is that the word Hindu often was not until 15th, in fact, even into 15th century, was never used by those who wrote in Sanskrit as a term of self-reference. Okay, so for example, in the context of Kirti Lata, there is a description of Jaunpur, where Vidyapati is creating this picture of how Jaunpur was a vibrant city, and it was so crowded that actually people constantly bumped into each other and rubbed shoulders and so on. And he refers to certain Turks, Turushk, as he calls them, Turuk in Apabhramsa. Uh, he refers to these Turuk men who were troublemakers, and they were particularly, antagonistic towards Hindus. Okay, so he says whenever he saw, a young man with tilak on their foreheads, he would, they would, that is the Turuk men would run after them and harass them and call them Hindu, Hindu. Okay, so quite clearly, the word Hindu here is being put in the mouth of a Turk, a Muslim, okay, who is referring to the Brahmanas as Hindus. Okay, and it's very interesting because sometimes people stop here and say, look, there is Hindu Muslim animosity over there. And look how Muslims were always so oppressive about Hindus. Here is a Turkish man who's running after the Brahmanas and forcing. Sometimes he sort of takes hold of his sacred thread and takes it away, and all this is mentioned. But if you read the whole chapter carefully, then you realize that very soon Vidyapati also comes round to saying that these trouble seekers, in spite of these trouble seekers, the peace of Jaunpur is maintained because of the greatness of Ibrahim Shah, the great ruler. And why? Because there are policemen at every nook and corner who keep an eye over these troublesome elements. So, on the one hand, he's saying that there are these Turks who use the word Hindu almost as a word of abuse, but he's also saying that there are these policemen who keep an eye over this, presumably that they are able to control these ruffians. And remember, Turks are actually talked about in this manner even in Islamic texts. So, if, for example, if you think of something like Waqiyat-e Mushtaki, they would refer to Afghans like that. Babur refers to Mongols like that. And everyone else uses abusive words towards Turks as uncouth, uncultured, extremely ill-behaved, ill-mannered, and so on. So Vidyapati is not the first person to use these words of description for the Turks.
The next question is from Chandrabhan Sahir, and his question is: could you please discuss in some length an intellectual history of Vidyapati, the kind of sources he was influenced or informed by?
Sorry, I lost the first few words.
Can you discuss in detail the intellectual history of Vidyapati, the kind of sources he was influenced and informed by?
Okay. You see, his the kind of literary traditions that must have had its influence on Vidyapati has to be mapped with reference to different texts. Say, for example, if you look at his Dharma Shastra, that is Vibhag Sar, he is it's clearly written as a doxography, that is as a text which basically quotes verbatim from other texts and puts them together, juxtaposes them together, and draws its conclusions. So there you would find references to Narada Smriti, Kamandak Smriti, Kautilya Arthashastra. You would find references to Manu Smriti, and a variety of other texts occasionally, but mainly Kamandak, Manusmriti, and Narad Smriti. These are the three texts that are most frequently quoted. Now, you think of a text like Purush Pariksha, for example, you can see a clear impact of the Sanskrit Katha literature. Okay, if you want to know, if someone wants to explore this any further, Francesca Orsini in 2017 wrote a wonderful essay on the Katha literature. Okay, so you can try and take a look at that. This was published in Modern Asian Studies. So the the Katha texts had a longish history, and so did the texts on Niti in Sanskrit. Okay, and you can clearly see an impact on Purush Pariksha of these texts. But more generally, you must understand that the intellectual world of the ideational world of a 15th century intellectual is actually varied. It is multilingual. Lots of ideas get sublimated and become part of everyday common sense in intellectual circles. And the best example is that of Likhnavali. I mentioned to you that Likhnavali was organized in a certain manner where there are actually four sections. The first three sections are about letters, where the first section is about how to write letters to superiors. The second one is about how to write letters to inferiors. The third one is how to write letters to your equals. Okay, and the fourth one is about documents. Now, this organization, interestingly, and I mentioned earlier that this was the first of its kind text in Sanskrit, but this kind of text was very common in Persian. Okay, in Persian, there was a 400 years of history for Insha and Rasail. Okay, and Insha was basically a text on how to write. So Amir Khusro wrote an Insha. Abul Fazl in 16th century wrote an Insha. In between, many others wrote Inshas. So in Persian, anyone who was a scholar of any stature would write an Insha because that was a sine qua non for proving their scholarship. Now interestingly, a text written around the time when Vidyapati wrote his Ratnavali in Persian actually sets the rules for how to write these things. And it says it should be divided into four parts. Okay? The first part should contain letters writing to superior, second to inferiors, third to equals, and fourth for documents. How does Vidyapati actually follow the same convention that was followed in Persia? Precisely because of the fact that what was known in established in Persian had also seeped into Sanskrit literary tradition. Because so far as we are aware, Vidyapati did not know how to read Persian. But he was clearly connected to the wider world and he was familiar with these traditions. So the impact on Vidyapati is that of the Dharma Shastras, clearly who he quotes. The impact is clearly those of the Katha texts. For example, he does refer occasionally to other Sanskrit writers, including Panchatantra. Okay, there is clearly an impact of Jayadev because remember, Radha was practically an invention of Jayadev in 11th 12th century. So he is obviously building on Jayadev, and where Jayadev wrote songs of Radha Krishna's love in Sanskrit, he was the first and perhaps the last person to have done so. Vidyapati repeats it in Avhat and Maithili. Okay, so the impact on Vidyapati is of varied linguistic and literary traditions, not a singular one.
The next question is from Himani Upadhyay, and her question is, could you please tell us more about Bhu Parikrama, Vidyapati's text on geography? She's curious about his conceptions of geographical space, particularly with respect to mountainous regions.
Okay, actually, that Himani might find it disappointing because Bhu Parikraman sets itself off as a text on describing the entire surface of the earth, but actually falls pretty short of it. Okay, so it starts by saying that here is um, here are two princes who are going to travel through the earth and visit different regions and try and tell stories about these regions. Okay, and certain yes aranyas are mentioned in fact aranyak the aranya bhumi is mentioned in Bhu Parikraman, but nothing more than that. In fact, the stories that you find associated with different regions, all these stories are later to be found in Purush Pariksha. Okay, so there is clearly some sort of intertextuality between the two. Unfortunately, Bhu Parikraman does not give us much information on real geography as we will understand it. But the the imagery of forest as a liminal world, as a world which perhaps has many mysteries, but a world which occupies that space between the urbane civilizational areas and that which is completely unknown. That sense is something which is invoked in Bhuparikraman very briefly.
Thank you very much, sir, for answering all the queries that we had. And I would request all the participants, if you have any other query, please send us at karwanheritage@gmail.com. We'll pass on those queries to Dr. Jha, and he can get back to you through email. So thank you so much, everybody who joined us live this evening for the Karwan lecture series on with the Vidyapatis in history and historiography, a missing link. I think all those who have joined us will go home and will read about Vidyapati more, and they'll find that missing link, and they'll try to bridge that gap that exists in the mainstream history, as sir pointed out. So thank you so much, sir, for taking out time for delivering this
Thank you,
lecture. It was
Ashan.
truly an honor.
Thank you, Ashan. It was a pleasure. Thanks. And thank you to everyone who joined in and were generous enough with their questions. And of course, yes, as you mentioned, I would be happy to respond to any queries that you might forward to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, and have a great evening.
You too. Thank you.